Welcome back, trainees, to Module 2 for Citrus. I just want to tell you this. I am watching Jaws because this is the fourth time I've tried to record this particular module, and the computer keeps crashing on me some way. So I'm watching Jaws late on Saturday night. If you hear me scream, it's because somebody was eating. But don't be concerned. Don't call the law or any of those kinds of things. It's just a movie. It's what I tell myself every time I go to the beach. It's just a movie. So let's go ahead and get over into a discussion about pest control, a little bit about diseases when it comes to citrus. So as I kind of referred to in Module 1, when it comes to citrus, a lot of these issues at this point in time seem a little bit irrelevant when we've got citrus greening, which has virtually annihilated commercial production in the state of Florida. But we still have lots of folks that are trying to grow citrus in their backyard, which is perfectly fine. What I always let them know is they're going to get citrus greening in their disease, but as long as it's producing fruit that tastes good to them, eat it. It's kind of like we say, if it's green, mow it in the yard. Well, if it tastes good, eat it. And the greening's not going to hurt them whatsoever, but they will see their tree decline. So at the end of this module, I'll come back around to greening, and but we still do see some of these issues very commonly, especially when we're dealing with folks that have citrus in the backyard. And when you've only got one or two trees invested into this, it's not a lot of money compared to the big folks on the commercial side of things. So a lot of these things we're not too concerned with trying to control unless we see that really being an issue for the life of the tree. Lose a few leaves, a branch here or there, a few fruits, not such a big deal to us, and really how the fruit looks as long as it tastes good from a backyard standpoint. So we're going to talk mites very briefly, a little bit about insects, definitely a little bit about diseases, and a lot of times they can look a little like some nutritional disorders, so we'll come back around to that toward the end. So we really have two different categories of citrus problems. We have those that occur above ground and those that occur below ground. Above ground, we're more concerned with things like rust mites, spider mites, lots of different types of insects, as well as a variety of diseases. When it comes to rust mites, as you can bet, are very closely related to spider mites, and all of them are closely related to spiders and not insects. So these are not insects. Go back to your entomology modules if you need to catch back up with some of that information. But these are teeny, teeny, tiny mites that like to feed on the leaves. They'll also feed on the fruit, and what they do is they basically scratch the epidermal cells. And as they do that, they cause what we call stippling or silvering or even bronzing types of disorders and visuals. And I'll show you some of that in just a second. Generally, we're looking for these with a hand lens because they are incredibly small. Most of the time, the highest populations are usually for rust mites in the humid summer going into fall months when we're getting a lot of rain. One of the more unusual things we know is that they like it hot and they like sun, but they don't like to feed directly in sunlight. So where we usually see results of their damage on the fruit is in the shady areas under the leaves. Not so much of a huge issue, except this can cause a lot of leaf drop, and they can cause us to have smaller fruit in many cases. So here in this slide, in the upper corner there, upper left-hand corner, you can see some tiny round clear eggs of citrus mites, and you can also see the mites themselves, which look pretty unusual, a little bit wider than they are longer. Go from anything like a straw whitish all the way over to a yellow or a brown in their adult stage. The picture to the bottom there is a perfect example of the feeding damage we'll see, especially in the summer, this bronzing type of effect. Now, if you notice, half of the orange right in the middle has that bronzing, and the other half looks pretty much normal. The other half was out in the sunlight. The mites were avoiding direct sun and were feeding, stippling, and scraping the exocarp, the outer surface of that rind in the shadier areas. So that's where we tend to see this kind of damage. Very classic damage. In the summer and the fall, we tend to have that bronze type of effect. In the spring, the injury tends to be a little bit more significant and a little bit harsher on the fruit itself, causing more damage or abrasion, and we get this shark skin type of effect. So these are very classic examples of rust mite damage. And here you can see it again on the fruit. We need to try to control these before symptoms appear, because the damage, when it's done, it's done. You can't heal this kind of damage. But generally, even if you have a heavy infestation of rust mite that can cause the fruit to not look so good and not be sellable, it doesn't mean it's not perfectly safe to eat and wouldn't even taste perfectly fine. And all that this particular graph is showing us is that we see real heavy populations of rust mite when we get into the warm, humid months of the year. From a control standpoint, there are different oils and whatnot that can be used, but we're generally looking at trying to start out with using things like even soapy water, but definitely neem in a backyard situation. Closely related to rust mites are spider mites. Now, we tend to see high populations of these in the dry spring and fall. So before the rains start and after the rains stop in the fall. And again, they cause it stippling type of abrasion on the epidermis. You can see that tiny little spider mite. And then there to the middle of the slide, you can see at the base of the leaf all these little stipples in the leaf itself, down at the base, kind of these white little circular areas. That's where it's been abraded or scratched, where they're feeding. We normally find a lot of leaf drop and some blisters and distortion, especially on new tissues at the tips of branches when it comes to spider mites. And one of the most indicative symptoms of spider mites, and where they get their name, is the webbing that you see there on the far right, especially in that new growth. You see that kind of webbing, and it's quite easy to see most of the time, especially with a heavy infestation. You've got spider mites. And again, control tends to be leaning toward soaps, over into neem, and maybe into some of the little bit heavier chemicals to get these under control. Really, really common in a lot of landscape plants as well. Now, insects on citrus, a little bit of a different situation. Insects are not mites, and mites are not insects. Okay? So go back to your entomology and look those over to make sure you know the differences between them. When it comes to insects on citrus, one of the most common we would find would be aphids. Aphids absolutely love that new tender foliage like they do on any plant. Oftentimes on the undersides of the leaves, along the stems. The best way to control these are going to be with the soapy water sprays, maybe headed toward the neem, and we may need quite a few different types of sprays and attempts at controlling these. A very good way to know if you've got aphids that you're not noticing is if you see a lot of ants running up and down the stems. If you see a lot of ants, ants like to farm aphids for their honeydew. So if you're seeing a lot of ants on these plants, you may have an insect problem that you need to control with aphids. Now, I really like this picture, even though it's a little distorted here, unfortunately. You can see some of the tiny little green aphids laying along the midrib of this leaf, and you see the ladybug. Now, you know the ladybug's a good guy that can help us control the aphids. But what about the two critters that look like they're going to crawl in your ear and eat your brain, like they came off of Star Trek, just down toward the base of all those aphids? Those are ladybug larvae. And if we're seeing quite a few of those, maybe we don't need a spray. Maybe we're letting our biologicals do their magic, and maybe we need to kind of stay out of their way unless the infestation just gets too big and out of control and we're seeing a lot of damage. From a damage standpoint, here's that cupping, the twisting, the distortion of new young leaves. And generally, we've got a lot of sooty mold that's associated with aphid feeding as well. And remember, that's not a disease. That is a superficial fungal feeding on the honeydew coming from the insects. So you control the aphids, you're going to control the sooty mold. One of our biggest nemesis would be the lubber grasshoppers. Nobody lubbers our lubbers, right? So even when they're in their small stage, juvenile, black, shiny stages, even all the way to the adults, we really don't have good chemical controls in the backyard. And the best thing that we can try to do is basically pull these guys off and either drown them in a bucket of soapy water or step on them. And they are very well known to do a lot of feeding damage and can strip our plants down. And this is unfortunately one of the things we just kind of have to live with in Florida for a few weeks every spring heading into summer. Citrus leaf miner is very common. We see leaf miner on a lot of different types of plants. And the leaf miner is kind of difficult to control simply because the larvae will work its way between the epidermal layers of the cells feeding, and the adult is a tiny, tiny little fly that you're just hardly ever going to notice buzzing around. So control is difficult to catch the fly to do any control and to also be able to get treatments into the leaf. That larvae is pretty much protected when it's inside of the leaf from treatment. So when we see leaf miner working in the leaf, best thing to do is pull that leaf off and discard it. Get it away. But a real heavy infestation like you see there in that left-hand picture might warrant some chemical controls in a few cases because we might be lowering our photosynthetic ability. We see it commonly, but it's not a common major issue. It tends to be a little bit more superficial in citrus. It's not quite the same story when it comes to scales. We have a lot of different types of scale insects. These two are piercing and sucking insects. They really like to set up shop along the mid-vein of a leaf where they have a lot of access to nutrients. Many different types of them will take on a lot of different looks, but they all will have a crawler stage that's immature, that's allowing them to move around. And then adult stages where they'll harden themselves off, sit up shop, and stay basically put, where they're protected under a hard coating. They will also produce waxy honeydew. They'll produce wax and kind of a cottony type material that will coat them, that will protect them as well. So chemical treatments can be a little bit difficult. So neem is usually where we head real quickly when it comes to scale, especially on a production situation. You can see up here in the top left-hand corner, black scale. You can see down toward the bottom in the left corner some of the more immature stages of scale. And then over to the right-hand side, fruit and leaves that are covered in sooty mold, because scales will produce a lot of sooty mold at the same time. And you can see the scale right down the mid-vein of that particular citrus leaf. It's where they love to be. And they can really suck the life right out of any kind of plant. From a control standpoint, we're generally looking at going with something like neem, soapy water, neem, all the way up to some of the malathions, some of the oils, and even Sevin sprays and dust to try to get these under control. As long as we're using a insecticide that's labeled for the particular plant, that's labeled for the particular insect we've got a problem with, and we're following label directions, we'll be perfectly fine and within the law. There are quite a few additional citrus problems that are a little bit unusual, and maybe ones we might not want to try to control, like this guy. Now, this is a caterpillar, can get pretty large, about 2.5 inches. It's called an orange dog, and while he can do quite a bit of damage, eating along the margins and causing some notching on the leaves, this is one we might not want to try to control unless the infestation is just really heavy, because he's the immature of our native swallowtail butterfly. So young trees might be harmed due to reduced leaf area when he's doing a lot of heavy feeding, but in many cases we probably want to leave him alone unless we really see the tree suffering in any way whatsoever. Most of the time, trees are going to recover just fine. Wind scar. Wind scar is not a disease, and it's not an insect issue. It can look a little bit like some of those, but this is where the fruit is being abraded by rubbing together, rubbing leaves, twigs, even the thorns on the citrus because of wind. It can actually damage and abrade that exocarp. This is primarily cosmetic. There's no kind of treatment that's necessary or that it would even be effective. It doesn't make it so pretty for sale, but it's going to taste perfectly fine and nothing to be worried about. Fruit splitting is usually a little bit of an issue in some of our younger trees, especially some of the cultivars that tend to have a thin peel. This is where we get a lot of water, high water content, and a lot of times in the fall the fruit will split. There's nothing we can do, no kind of treatments or prevention. A lot of times the trees, as they grow older, they'll grow out of a lot of this, but it's very common to have at least a few pieces of fruit split on any trees. Very, very common, but nothing to be concerned about. Now this is a really nice illustration showing the difference between that superficial sooty mold caused by insect infestations down on the bottom left compared to an actual disease that we see fairly frequently in the top right, and that's called greasy spot. And this really is what, okay, somebody just got eaten on Jaws, so give me just a moment. I have to collect myself. Okay, I'm back. All right, everything's fine now. So greasy spot then it very much looks like you had grease on your hands and you kind of rubbed on that fruit a little bit. Pretty much going to be superficial unless it was a real heavy infestation. But this is where the fungal infection gets between the individual oil pits on the exocarp and makes it not look so pretty, okay? But we see this quite frequently, and nothing generally to be too concerned about, especially if you were just going to be eating it at home. But if you were trying to sell it, it might be a little bit of a issue trying to get optimal price out of that kind of fruit. So here's a little bit more about greasy spot. You can see it a little bit closer up on that fruit. On the leaves, we do see yellow spots that first start to appear. It can lower photosynthetic ability somewhat, which can be a little bit of a problem for the tree in a heavy infestation. And if we get a lot of this one, we can see all those individual little infections coalesce into what we call a rind blotch. And you can see some of these corky looking lesions on this fruit a little bit more up close where they've started to kind of blend together. On the underside of the leaves, it definitely looks like it's been almost sprayed and burned with grease. This is a little bit of a later infestation. Control, the best things that we can do is sanitation, trying to remove and rake out any of the leaves or the fruit that has dropped underneath, because as rain falls on that, it's going to splash those spores from the fungus back up onto the uninfected portions of the plant, spreading disease. And this is just an illustration showing you that greasy spot's going to be more predominant through the warm, humid times of the year. And from a control standpoint, you're going to see this for most all the fungal diseases. Repetitive copper fungicides are going to be some of our best alternatives from a chemical standpoint to try to get these under control. Sometimes it's not even necessary. So here again, taking a quick look at the difference between greasy spot on the top right compared to that superficial sooty mold that we could just rub right off the surface on the bottom of that leaf. Now moving over into citrus scab, this one looks a little bit worse. Definitely doesn't look too appealing. If this is not a heavy infestation, it usually doesn't do much damage. It can cause the fruit to drop before it matures, which is unfortunate. Doesn't look so good on the outside, but this would be edible in most all cases. It wouldn't hurt you. You can see these corky kind of lesions that appear on the fruit and also on the leaves that become distorted over time. The leaves on one side will have these corky raised lesions. On the back side of the leaf, it almost looks like there's an indentation where that corky lesion on the other side is trying to pull the bottom epidermis through that leaf. So this one is relatively common. Again, the best type of control we have for that is sanitation and the use and rotation of different copper fungicides. Now this is melanose, another fungal infection. Looks a little bit like the wind scar that we saw earlier. Now, how this gets started is on the top of the fruit, you'd have the fungal infection starting with these tiny little rough indentations that you can see all around on the fruit. And as it rains or irrigation were to hit it, the spores tend to drip down the sides and around toward the bottom of the fruit, spreading the spores and spreading the infection, giving it somewhat of a wind-scarred look. But in comparison to wind scar, you're not going to have all the tiny infections on wind-scarred fruit like you do on melanose infected fruit. Again, can cause early fruit drop. Not a serious issue in the backyard. You can see it here on the leaves with tiny, tiny corky lesions. There's even one particular species of the fungus that causes this star-like effect on the lesion on the underside, and we call that star melanose. Treatment is definitely going to rely on sanitation and copper fungicide. So I'm going to sound like a broken record when it comes to control of these fungal infections. Moving on to Alternaria brown spot. Alternaria can cause a wide variety of diseases. As you see here on citrus, it can affect the leaves, distorting them, causing them to notch and pieces to kind of rot out. Same thing can happen on the fruit where we get tiny little lesions where they kind of begin to rot. This can cause early fruit drop. It could, in severe situations, kill the whole tree. But a lot of times it's more or less cosmetic and not much of an issue on the fruit. It'd definitely be edible, this fruit that you see here. It's nothing I would worry about trying to eat. And again, we're going to be trying to control that with copper fungicides. And here again is a picture of the leaf scar just to show you that we don't have all the tiny little fungal rough infection points like we do with fungal infected fruit. This is just a wind scar, so not tear streaking. Now post-bloom fruit drop's a little bit different. It is caused by a fungal infection, but it catches the blossom and we don't get to the fruit part. And we end up with what's called buttons left behind, where the blooms were originally at. This one is a little bit problematic that we do tend to see it from time to time on pretty much all of our trees, and it's going to take a small percentage of the fruit every year. And unfortunately, we really don't have any kind of chemical control for this one. Very, very common though. And again, you always lose a little bit of fruit to it, but not usually enough to make much of a difference in a backyard situation. Now, this is brown rot on the fruit, actually caused by a fungal-like organism called Phytophthora, and there are so many species of Phytophthora that can affect every portion of the plant. This literally causes a rot, and you can see here where it starts out with a brown, soft rot that progresses to a necrotic lesion that just rots away, and this fruit would not be edible in any way whatsoever. Best treatments we have is rotations of copper fungicides, definitely avoiding any kind of overhead irrigation. Proper sanitation is all we can really do to try to prevent it. Not incredibly common on the fruit, but we do see it from time to time. Below ground, quite a few issues. Again, a lot of these are almost irrelevant in this day and age because of greening, but we do have some issues with some root rots, some viruses, and even viroids that infect especially the rootstocks, nematodes, which are tiny microscopic roundworms. Lots of water issues. Overwatering, underwatering are major issues with citrus that can lead to some different kinds of blights. And keep in mind, by the time we see the above ground symptoms like chlorosis in this case, because of below ground damage, it's pretty much too late to do anything to control the problem. And a lot of these are going to definitely be fatal types of diseases and issues. Like foot rot. Now this is caused by Phytophthora again, and this is where the base of the trunk, the tree, is being rotted. And it will usually girdle the entire base of the plant, killing away the bark, leaving that cambium exposed and killing it, leaving this gummy kind of residue streaking down the plant where it's being attacked and infected from this pathogen. There is absolutely nothing we can do to prevent this. This is a sanitation issue. This can also be an issue from how we are culturally maintaining our plants. Make sure we're keeping weeds away. Make sure we're keeping the water from doing damage to the base of that tree. So this is very much a cultural type of issue that we have to control from a water standpoint. And here it is from a pomelo. You can see where the lesion has begun at the base of the plant, and the lesion is starting to curl back onto the healthy tissue, and it will progress to entirely girdle that plant and eventually kill it fairly rapidly, in fact. Now this is in comparison to some similar looking rots that we get from viruses and viroids down at the base of the plant. The main difference here is you're not going to see that gummy residue that starts to build up. And again, it really doesn't matter because these are definitely going to be fatal types of diseases. Not incredibly much of an issue anymore because of greening. We just don't get to this point much anymore at this point in time. But we see these causing a lot of scaling, dwarfing of the plant, and even funny rings and spots on the fruit when infestation first begins. We do have viruses that are still predominant, especially in our sour orange rootstock, like Citrus testacea. In the 90s and early 2000s, this was very much of an issue that would kill a plant very quickly. This is carried around or vectored by aphids. And you can see that in comparison from the top slide to the middle slide, where we have kind of a slow spreading decline from a burrowing nematode that's burrowing into the roots and doing damage. It can look a whole lot like citrus greening because it can decline fairly slowly, but this is going to be a quicker decline than greening once it really gets started. And then we can move over here to a discussion about a disease that we still see today, was very much in the news all over the place in the 90s and into the early 2000s. It's a bacterial infection called citrus canker that produces these small round little blisters that have a yellow halo around a center corky lesion. So here it is on the leaves. The lesions tend to show up very quickly after infection begins, usually within a week or two. And on the underside of the leaves, we usually see these lesions that are raised. They're corky if you were to feel of them, and they almost have a water-soaked margin. You can see that, especially toward the bottom part of that leaf. So take a good look at that. And on the fruit, we have these lesions, and in most cases, this is relatively superficial. Serious infestation, it could potentially kill the tree, but that fruit is pretty much edible. From Florida's standpoint, we somewhat may have overreacted to this back in the 90s, trying to control it. Now, it is highly contagious, but we really tried to control this because of the citrus industry, kind of forgetting the fact that we're a juicing industry. And this wasn't, in most cases, a big problem for the juicing industry. But it does spread rapidly over very short distances because of wind-driven rain, overhead irrigation, flooding, insects, birds, and mostly us, moving it around on our hands, our clothes, our shoes, our cars, our equipment. So this used to be one of the biggest issues we were looking out for in citrus. Unfortunately, this was very preliminary and not nearly as serious and fatal as citrus greening that we have today. Now, this is the critter responsible for citrus greening. This is the Asian citrus psyllid, and this is a very, very tiny insect that moves very quickly, incredibly high populations of it. This vectors the bacterium that causes citrus greening, and you can even see some of the droppings, the honeydew, that clear, that turns almost white, little circles of honeydew. That's almost the only way you know there's been much feeding. And we know this arrived somewhere in the late 90s. It has spread throughout all of the citrus growing areas. And wherever you have this psyllid, you are absolutely going to have greening. It loves to eat on the new growth, and we know that the females that are infected really like to go for the uninfected trees that are healthier. And basically, what happens is this particular bacterium forms a plaque in the phloem tissue of the plant, and it almost acts like a slow heart attack over time. And the symptoms really do at first begin to mimic nutritional deficiencies because the plant is basically starving if the phloem's not working correctly. But that little psyllid right there is the reason that our citrus industry has been brought to its knees. You will see a little bit of sooty mold because of that honeydew that's left behind, but not nearly as much as you would from other types of insect feeding. Here's some of the symptoms. At first glance, you might think, oh, this looks nutritional. This looks like a nitrogen deficiency, but if you look closely, you'll see that the whole leaf is not affected, only certain areas. So we end up with this blotchy model of discoloration, especially in the older leaves, where you have kind of this green island type effect, and this will also happen on the fruit. And this particular disease, especially across Asia, it's called green dragon, green island, HLB, Huanglong Bing. It's got all kinds of different names that basically mean blotchy mottle is what it looks like. So we see a yellowing in the shoots, the twigs start to die back, especially in one small portion at first in the tree. And the tree declines slowly over time. It might take 4, 5, 6, 8 years for the tree to die, but we will start to see symptoms quickly, at least in small portions, small branches of the tree after it's been fed upon by an infected psyllid. We'll see the leaves start to drop over time. We'll see early fruit drop. We will notice that the fruit itself will either be very bitter or have no kind of flavor whatsoever. It'll be very dry. It'll be lopsided and malformed on the outside, like you see here in this picture at the top. And on the inside, if you were to cut down the middle of that citrus fruit, the left compared to the right should be virtually identical, and that will not be the case. It will definitely be lopsided inside and out, and that is an indicative symptom of greening. We know that the seeds will abort, the fruit will drop off before ripening. It has poor color or yellow islands or green islands on it, and that tree is going to lose vigor and it is going to die. Kind of a slow death over time. And it is kind of sad to go into our groves and see this early fruit drop, and to see the trees decline slowly over time and the loss of an industry. This is the loss of an era. I do think that we will see a resurgence in our citrus industry in the state of Florida. University of Florida is working very, very hard, and I believe we'll see probably a multi-pronged approach from resistant fruit stocks to maybe even different ways of grafting, different cultivars that we'll be going for. I think the notion of producing citrus for juicing in Florida is probably gone for the most part. I think what we'll be moving toward is more of the California type of production where we're looking at specialty crops that have a higher dollar associated with them. It's going to be less of the oranges and grapefruits and lemons and more of the specialties like the satsumas and the mandarins and the tangelos. But I do think we will have a new industry that will come out of all the research that's being done, but there's going to be a lot of things that are required to get us back to a successful industry. And the University of Florida is definitely leading that charge, and we will get there, but it takes time. And so we're trying our best to work with growers, but we're also trying to work with homeowners because, citrus is so synonymous with Florida, just like Mickey Mouse at this point in time. So from an economic standpoint, this is critical for us. And from just a way of life in Florida, it's important that we get our citrus industry back.